Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and we're going to continue our lesson on the cell cycle today. So have you ever taken a test and your teacher tells you to go back and make sure you double check your work before you turn it in? You want to make sure you get as many of those questions right as possible, right? Well, the cell cycle kind of has something similar going on. Because the cell cycle is how we make your body, is how we're making new cells to make your body, it's really important that we get this as correct as possible. So today I wanted to talk about some important checkpoints that are happening along the cell cycle to make sure that the cells that we're making are exactly what we want to make, and that's going to prevent us from having any issues down the line, okay? So today we're talking about how to control the cell cycle and some important checkpoints that we're meeting along the way. Just as a review, what is the cell cycle? Well, the cell cycle is how a cell lives its life. It's how we divide a cell to make new cells, okay? Remember that you started off as just a single cell. When you were a fetus in your mother's womb, you were one cell large. That was as soon as your mother's egg and your father's sperm came together to make you. You were one cell. Well, we took that one cell and we divided it and divided it and divided it until we got to where you are today. Your body now is made up of trillions of cells, okay? Well, the cell cycle is how we make that happen. And I just wanted to review the different steps of the cell cycle real quick with y'all. So remember that the longest part of the cell cycle is interphase. I know in this picture it's the smallest part, but interphase is actually where a cell spends the majority of its life. And it's made up of those three different smaller subsections. You got G1, S, and then G2. Okay, after G2, we move into something called mitosis, and mitosis has four different parts. Let's remember PMAT. PMAT are the four steps of mitosis, and they tell us what the names of those stages are. We go to prophase, and then metaphase, anaphase, and then telophase is the last one. And we talked about those in a lot of details over the last couple of units. Okay? The last part of the cell cycle is called cytokinesis. And cytokinesis, this is when we're splitting the cell down the middle to make two new cells. And then you can see that the whole process just starts back over. Just because you go through the cell cycle once doesn't mean you're done. This is always happening. Okay? As soon as a cell gets made, it starts the cell cycle, and it's going to continue to go through these steps until it divides. Okay, so along this journey though, there are some checkpoints. We're going to kind of stop the cell cycle for a moment, check that the cells are doing everything correctly. If they are, we're going to let it proceed through the cell cycle, and if we've made a hiccup or some sort of issue, we're going to stop it and make sure we correct the issue before we move on to the next part of the cell cycle. So for the cell cycle, there are three important checkpoints that we're getting to. And for each checkpoint, we're making sure that the cell is dividing in the correct way. The first checkpoint is during the G1 phase. The G1 phase is the first part of interphase. So this is like the very beginning of the cell cycle. In this checkpoint, we're going to determine if a cell can proceed to divide. And it's going to look at things like environmental condition, cell health, and size. Okay? If the conditions for a cell are not favorable to divide, it'll just stay in this kind of resting state. Okay? So we want to make sure that the cell has plenty of nutrients and that it's healthy. If it doesn't have nutrients, if it's not healthy, we don't want it to divide because that's just going to make more issues down the line. If a cell's not healthy, it's not going to divide. We only let the healthy cells divide here. Okay? If the conditions are favorable, then the cell will enter the S phase. Remember, the S phase is when we're duplicating that DNA and we're kind of getting ready to divide. If the conditions are not favorable, then the cell enters a resting period, and it'll just stay there until either the conditions are more favorable or there's enough nutrients to support these additional cells. Okay, so this is the first checkpoint. This checkpoint is really saying, hey, we've got the resources for this cell to divide. If we don't have the resources, we'll just let it rest for a little bit until we can come up with the resources for additional cells. So that's the first checkpoint of the cell cycle. Okay, here are the next two checkpoints in the cell cycle. The next one happens in the G2 phase. Okay, what's happening here, remember that the G2 comes immediately after the S phase. In the S phase, our goal is to replicate that DNA. That DNA is really, really important. If the DNA is not right, if it's not an exact identical match to what we started with, that means that a mutation has occurred, and some mutations can be really dangerous. So what's happening here is that we're checking the DNA repair enzymes examine and correct DNA replications. This kind of works like proofreading. Have you ever been typing something on the computer and then you see that little red line and it tells you that you've made some sort of spelling mistake? Well, that's what these enzymes are doing. They're going down the DNA, they're making sure that all the bases are correct. If they're not correct, we're going to fix them. And when we fix them, that's going to prevent a mutation from happening down the line. Okay, if there's too many mutations in DNA, that's going to make the cell mutate, and that could be bad for us in the long run. Okay, once this checkpoint is successfully navigated, mitosis is going to commence. And that means that mitosis is going to start up immediately after this checkpoint. Okay, the next checkpoint is in mitosis. With the mitosis checkpoint, what's happening here is that it indicates the conclusion of mitosis, and we're going to reinitiate the G1 phase. Okay, so these are ways that your cells kind of double check. Just like your teacher asks you to double check your work before you turn your test in, the cell is going to double check at its work. Have we made the DNA the correct way? Are we able to support additional cells? If those answers are yes, if the DNA is correct, if we have resources, then we'll proceed to the next step. If we've made an error along the way, we're going to correct it before we move to the next phase. Okay? Great. So let me just review this with you real quick, and then we'll get y'all going. Okay? So here's another way, more information about controlling the cell cycle. When a checkpoint fails, several issues can arise. So one, if one of those checkpoints are not checked correctly, or if there's an issue, you can actually get the development of cancer. What is cancer? Cancer is uncontrolled cell growth, which can lead to some sort of tumor, okay? Where cells divide excessively and they spread abnormally. So these checkpoints, especially that one in the G2 phase when we're looking at the DNA, that's going to help us cut down on the amount of cancer in your body. Okay, so that's a really important checkpoint. Another reason that we're making all of these checkpoints is that we're trying to reduce the amount of mutation. Okay, a mutation is when there's an error in the DNA. If a mutation goes undetected by the checkpoint, it can result in the overproduction of growth hormones, and that's going to disrupt normal cell regulation. Okay, so we want to make sure that that DNA is correct as possible. Something else that we're checking for here is cellular damage. Your cells can be damaged by the environment, okay? This can lead to damage of cells that can trigger continuous repair processes. This potentially leads to the dysfunction of cell behavior. So there's a lot of carcinogens that we are exposed to every day. Even sunlight has UV light, and that can cause mutations in your skin cells. So before those cells divide, we want to make sure that the mutations aren't too dangerous, or to go back and see if we can correct the DNA before it's replicated more. So checking over the DNA and the organelles in the cells as the cell cycle goes on is super important. It keeps us from getting healthy. It keeps us from not having cancer as much as we already do. And so these are a couple of things that we're trying to prevent by hitting these checkpoints along the cell cycle. So y'all, thank you so much for making it today. Your teacher has some other assignments for you to practice all of this stuff on. Make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.